Your family tree probably ends a few hundred years ago. Perhaps you have reached the 18th century, maybe the 17th if you were lucky. Then parish registers become incomplete. Handwriting becomes difficult to decipher. Names change spelling. Records disappear. Eventually, the documents simply stop. But your ancestors did not stop existing. So what happens if we keep traveling backwards? Past the Industrial Revolution, past the Tudors, past the medieval kingdoms, past the Normans, Vikings, and Anglo-Saxons. Keep going until even England itself disappears from the map. In the year AD 43, Roman armies crossed the Channel into an island already inhabited by millions of people. They lived in farmsteads, villages, and fortified settlements. They raised children, inherited land, traded across long distances, and belonged to communities that had existed for generations. And that leaves an extraordinary question. Could some of those people have been your ancestors? There is no surname that can prove it. There is no commercial DNA percentage that can prove it. And there is certainly no family legend that can carry an unbroken genealogy across 2,000 years by itself. But there are clues, and some of the most meaningful are hiding in places you might never think to look. Geography, ancient place names, archaeology, population history, family records, and DNA can all tell parts of the story. Over the next 10 clues, we are going to move from the most intriguing but uncertain signs towards the evidence that matters most. By the end, you will know which clues deserve attention, which popular ancestry claims should make you cautious, and how realistically you can investigate whether your family's roots in Britain may stretch far beyond the surviving paper trail. And remember this, because it will matter later. One of the strongest clues has almost nothing to do with your surname. Before we go further, tell me in the comments the oldest British county or region you have traced your family to. And if uncovering the hidden history behind British families is your kind of investigation, subscribe to UK Bloodlines. Keep that location in your mind, because several of the clues ahead depend heavily on geography. To understand why, imagine Britain shortly before Rome arrived. There was no single nation called England, Scotland, or Wales, and describing everyone simply as one homogeneous Celtic people hides an enormous amount of complexity. Britain contained farming communities, trading centers, hill forts, local aristocracies, and political groups whose influence overlapped and changed. Roman writers later gave us names such as the Iceni in eastern Britain, the Catuvellauni and Trinovantes in the southeast, the Atrebates farther south, the Dumnonii in the west, the Brigantes across much of northern England, the Dumnonii in the southwest, and peoples such as the Silures and Ordovices in Wales. Those labels matter, but they are not neat ancestral boxes into which modern families can simply be placed. The real story begins much closer to home. The first clue is the region where your oldest reliably documented ancestors lived. Suppose your family records repeatedly lead back to Cornwall, Devon, Wales, Cumbria, Yorkshire, East Anglia, or another part of Britain with a particularly deep archaeological history. Does that mean your ancestors were living there before the Romans? No. A county on a 19th century census cannot establish ancestry in the Iron Age, and modern county borders are not ancient tribal boundaries. People moved for work, marriage, war, land, and opportunity. Yet geography still matters, because populations are not constantly shuffled at random. Many families remained relatively local for surprisingly long periods, especially before modern transport transformed mobility. Your first task, then, is not to find an ancient tribal map and place your surname inside one of its colored territories. It is to identify the earliest location you can actually prove. A baptism register, marriage record, will, tax document, or census entry is more useful than a family story saying your ancestors were always from somewhere. One documented village is worth more than 10 romantic legends. Think about the oldest ancestor you have actually documented, not the family legend, not the surname website, the person you can place on a genuine record. Where were they living? That location leads to the second clue, because a region becomes more interesting when your family refuses to leave it. Imagine discovering your great-grandparents in one village, then their parents in the same parish, another generation 3 miles away, and an earlier marriage record in the neighboring settlement. Suddenly, a location becomes a pattern. If several branches of the family remain within a remarkably small area across 2, 3, or 4 centuries, you have evidence of geographic continuity. But even extraordinary continuity through written records does not create a bridge directly to AD 43. 400 years in one valley is impressive, yet it still leaves more than 1,000 undocumented years. The temptation is to fill that darkness with certainty. Genealogy cannot do that. What it can do is identify a landscape in which your family has demonstrably deep roots. And once you know that landscape, something curious happens. The documents may fall silent, but the landscape itself begins to speak. Sometimes it speaks through names. Britain is covered in place names created in different linguistic periods. Some contain Old English or Old Norse elements, others developed during the medieval period. But beneath those layers are names whose linguistic ancestry reaches into Brittonic languages spoken before English existed. Rivers are especially revealing because their names can survive extraordinary political change. The Thames, Avon, Exe, Usk, and Derwent all preserve linguistic histories far older than most British surnames. Avon itself ultimately derives from a Brittonic word for river. Imagine, for example, tracing several branches of your family for 300 years through communities clustered around one ancient river valley. The family surnames change as daughters marry. Occupations change. One branch moves a few villages away, yet generation after generation remains inside essentially the same landscape, while the river beside them carries a name older than England itself. That does not prove those families were there in the Iron Age. But suddenly you are no longer investigating only a surname. You are investigating the relationship between a family and a landscape. Ancient place names reveal how fragments of older Britain survived even as languages and rulers changed. The twist is that living beside an ancient river does not mean your ancestors named it. Newcomers can adopt existing names, just as populations can adopt new languages. Place names preserve memory, not individual pedigrees. And this exposes one of the most seductive mistakes in genealogy. Assuming an ancient-sounding surname must itself be ancient. British surnames derived from villages, rivers, valleys, hills, or estates can preserve remarkable geographic information, but most hereditary surnames in Britain are far younger than the Iron Age. The people who watched Roman armies arrive in AD 43 were not passing modern hereditary surnames from parent to child as we do today. So a surname may guide you towards a place with deep history, but it cannot carry your genealogy across 2,000 years. Surname origin and biological ancestry are different questions. There is another reason this matters. Your surname represents only a tiny fraction of your ancestry. 10 generations ago, your family tree potentially contains hundreds of ancestral positions. Go farther, and a single surname becomes an increasingly narrow thread inside a vast network of people. If you concentrate only on the name you carry today, you may actually overlook the strongest evidence of deep ancestry. Another clue is regional language and cultural survival. Welsh preserves a Brittonic linguistic tradition whose roots reach far beyond the creation of England. Cornish endured in southwest Britain before declining as a community language and later being revived. Cumbric, once spoken farther north, disappeared, but traces survive in place names. Language can therefore reveal cultural continuity, but language is not DNA. People adopt new languages without being biologically replaced. Newcomers can assimilate into older communities. Customs can survive after languages disappear, and languages can survive while populations change. That complexity is exactly why deep ancestry cannot be solved by finding one supposedly Celtic word in a family tradition. Now ask yourself something harder. How many generations does your family remain in the same landscape before the paper trail disappears? Because when names, documents, and even languages begin to fail us, the ground beneath that landscape preserves another kind of memory. Imagine an archaeologist walking into a British field that appears almost empty. Grass moves in the wind. There are no houses and no names carved into stone. Yet beneath the soil are post holes from buildings, fragments of pottery, storage pits, field boundaries, trackways, and the remains of livestock. On a nearby ridge, an Iron Age hill fort still overlooks the valley. Then Roman objects begin appearing in later layers. The material culture changes, but farming continues. Paths continue to be used. People continue to live and die within the same wider landscape. This is where archaeological continuity becomes important. Archaeology cannot normally identify your individual ancestor, but it can tell us whether landscapes remained occupied, whether settlements were abandoned, whether farming continued, and how dramatically life changed when political power shifted. Across Britain, the picture varies enormously. Some settlements declined, Others evolved. New towns, roads, and villas appeared. Military sites transformed particular regions. But the millions of people living here did not simply evaporate when Rome arrived. And that brings us to one of the biggest misconceptions in British ancestry. Imagine southern Britain in the spring of AD 43. Across the Channel, ships are gathering. Soldiers prepare weapons and armor. Horses, supplies, and engineers are being organized for an invasion backed by one of the most powerful states in the ancient world. Yet inland, ordinary life continues. Smoke rises from farmsteads. Livestock move between fields. Traders follow routes that existed before Rome built its famous roads. Children are born into families with no idea that historians 2,000 years later will debate what became of them. Then, the Roman army arrives. Road networks are constructed and expanded. Towns develop. Taxes are collected. Local elites negotiate, cooperate, or resist. Rebellions erupt, the most famous associated with Boudica and the Iceni. Eventually, much of Britain becomes incorporated into the Roman Empire. But political conquest is not the same thing as population replacement. Rome brought soldiers, administrators, merchants, and migrants from many regions of the empire. Roman Britain became connected to continental Europe, North Africa, and the wider Mediterranean world. Migration and intermarriage followed. Yet beneath this transformation remained large numbers of people whose ancestors had lived in Britain before the conquest. Romanization changed architecture, diet, economy, clothing, status, and culture in complicated ways. It did not require the existing population to disappear. A family could gradually become culturally Roman while remaining descended substantially from people who had lived in Britain before Roman rule. And this changes the question completely. If some of your ancestors remained in Roman Britain, AD 43 was not necessarily the beginning of their presence here. It may simply have been the moment the political world around them changed. If you have already recognized a region connected to your family, put the county, town, or village in the comments. I'm especially curious how many of us can trace documented lines back to the same small part of Britain for several centuries. But Rome creates another mystery because conquering Britain was only half the story. What happened to those families when Rome itself disappeared? Early in the 5th century, Roman rule in Britain unraveled. Imperial institutions weakened, coin use declined dramatically, urban life changed, and new political systems developed. Later came migrations from continental Europe associated with peoples we commonly call Anglo-Saxons. For generations, historians argued over what this meant for the population already living here. Were earlier Britons driven away? Were they conquered and absorbed? Did enormous numbers of newcomers simply replace them? The answer is more complicated than any simple replacement story. Migration from continental Northern Europe was substantial and had major demographic consequences, particularly in parts of eastern and southern England. But the degree of ancestry associated with these migrations varied geographically, and the whole population of Britain was not uniformly swept away. Different regions experienced different combinations of migration, integration, cultural transformation, and continuity. In Western Britain, Brittonic languages and political traditions remained especially strong. Elsewhere, communities increasingly adopted Old English and Anglo-Saxon identities, but culture can change much faster than ancestry. Imagine the descendant of a Romano-British farming family, eventually speaking Old English, living under an Anglo-Saxon ruler, and carrying a Germanic personal name. Centuries later, that person's descendants acquire a hereditary surname. Nothing in that surname necessarily reveals the family's earlier history. Then came Scandinavian settlement and Viking armies. Later came the Norman conquest. Towns expanded, villages disappeared, people married newcomers and moved across regions. Britain was repeatedly reshaped, but reshaping is not the same as erasing everything underneath. So imagine your surname disappeared tomorrow. Every document containing it vanished. What evidence would still connect your family to that place? That question takes us towards one of the most important developments in the entire investigation, because science has given historians a way to investigate populations even when written records are completely silent. Ancient DNA allows researchers to analyze genetic material recovered from people who actually lived centuries or millennia ago. Instead of relying only on artifacts, burial customs, or historical descriptions, researchers can compare populations across time and detect major patterns of migration, mixture, and continuity. And the first surprise is that pre-Roman Britain was itself already the product of migration. The people encountered by Rome in AD 43 were not an untouched population whose ancestors had occupied Britain unchanged since the end of the Ice Age. Britain's prehistoric population had already experienced major movements and mixtures over thousands of years. There was never one permanent genetic population called the ancient Britons, frozen in time. Ancient DNA can reveal whether populations from different periods were genetically similar, whether substantial new ancestry appeared after migration, and how those patterns varied between regions. It can help reconstruct enormous demographic events that no surviving family tree could ever record. But there is something ancient DNA cannot do. It cannot reliably take your modern saliva sample and announce, you descend from the Iceni, or your ancestors were Brigantes. Iron Age political identities were not isolated biological populations carrying unique tribal genetic barcodes. Likewise, a commercial DNA estimate describing ancestry as English, Welsh, Scottish, or broadly Celtic is not a certificate identifying your ancestor's tribe 2,000 years ago. Yet ancient DNA reveals something far more important for our investigation. Conquest does not necessarily erase ancestry. Populations mix. New ancestry arrives. Older ancestry survives inside later populations. People who eventually speak different languages, worship differently, and carry completely different names can still inherit ancestry from populations who lived in the same broad region centuries earlier, which finally brings us to the strongest clue. And as promised at the beginning, it is not your surname. It is not a DNA percentage. It is not an ancient river. It is not simply being born in Cornwall, Wales, Yorkshire, Cumbria, or East Anglia. The strongest clue is convergence. Imagine your documented family tree repeatedly leads into the same small region. Several independent branches remain there across centuries. A surname has a genuine local origin, but you recognize that the surname itself is medieval rather than Iron Age. Archaeology demonstrates long-term human occupation across the surrounding landscape. Historical evidence indicates that older populations were not simply erased by Roman conquest or every later migration. Population genetics shows that ancestry from earlier inhabitants could persist within later regional populations. No single piece proves that a particular Iron Age person was your ancestor. But when independent forms of evidence point in the same direction, the possibility becomes historically meaningful. That is the difference between finding an exciting clue and proving a pedigree. Documented genealogy identifies individuals you can demonstrate are related to you. Archaeology reconstructs the communities and landscapes in which earlier populations lived. Linguistics preserves cultural history. Population genetics reveals broad ancestry and migration patterns. Surnames may identify medieval geographic origins. Family traditions may tell you where to investigate. None can replace the others, but together they can tell a much richer story. And perhaps that sounds less spectacular than discovering a website claiming your surname belonged to an Iron Age warrior. It shouldn't, because consider what you are really looking at. Your documented tree may reach back 300 years, perhaps 500. But behind those recorded farmers, miners, laborers, merchants, fishermen, soldiers, and craftsmen stand thousands upon thousands of earlier lives. Eventually, their surnames disappear. Then surnames themselves disappear. Parish registers vanish. Medieval documents vanish. Written references become rare. Eventually, there is nothing left that can name them individually. But the disappearance of their names is not the disappearance of the people. Somewhere in Britain 2,000 years ago, a family woke before sunrise. Smoke rose through the opening of a roundhouse. Someone carried water. Someone checked livestock. Children learned the boundaries of fields their parents already knew. Perhaps traders brought objects and stories from distant places. Perhaps rumors eventually reached them that an army was gathering across the sea. They could not know that historians would call their world Iron Age Britain. They certainly could not know that their descendants might one day wonder whether they were Celtic, Roman, Anglo-Saxon, Viking, Norman, or British. Then Rome came. Generations passed. Some descendants may have lived in Roman-style houses. Others remained on farms. Some entered towns or military communities. Some married people whose families had arrived from distant parts of the empire. Then Rome left. Kingdoms rose. New settlers crossed the North Sea. Languages changed. Christianity transformed society. Viking armies came. Norman nobles arrived. Medieval surnames formed. Villages grew and disappeared. Families moved into towns. Centuries later, industrialization pulled millions towards mines, factories, and cities. At every stage, Britain changed, and your ancestors changed with it. That is why asking whether your ancestors were Celtic, Roman, Anglo-Saxon, Viking, or Norman can create a false choice. If your ancestry has deep roots in Britain, your family tree may contain people connected to several of those populations and many others besides. One branch could descend substantially from communities present before Rome, while another entered Britain centuries later from Scandinavia, Normandy, Ireland, or elsewhere. Family trees merge histories that textbooks separate. There may never be a parchment carrying your surname back to AD 43. There will almost certainly never be a continuous chain of records identifying one family generation by generation across 2,000 years. That is partly the point. The records disappear. The people do not. If you want to investigate your own family, begin with what you can prove. Work backwards through birth, marriage, and death records, censuses, parish registers, wills, and local archives. Find the earliest reliable location and see whether multiple branches remain in that landscape. Then use archaeology, local history, linguistics, and population genetics to understand the deeper world behind the records without pretending they can fill every missing generation. Because uncertainty does not make this investigation meaningless. It makes it real. If you have traced your family in Britain, tell me your surname, the oldest British location you have documented, and roughly how far back your records go. And subscribe to UK Bloodlines because there are many more stories hiding behind Britain's names, places, and bloodlines. 2,000 years ago, somewhere in Britain, an ordinary family watched the world around them change. They did not know Rome was about to become part of their story. Their descendants could not know that Rome itself would one day disappear. Languages changed, kingdoms rose, new peoples arrived, old communities mixed with newcomers. Their descendants adopted new names, new customs, and eventually surnames those Iron Age ancestors could never have imagined. We may never know their names, but that does not mean their story ended. Because somewhere between the archaeology beneath our feet, the history written into Britain's rivers and valleys, the migrations preserved in ancient DNA, and the ancestry carried quietly from one generation to the next, lies an extraordinary possibility. Before Britain belonged to Rome, before England existed, before surnames and parish registers and family trees, this island already belonged to families. And one of those families may have been yours. The paper trail eventually ends. Your family's story doesn't.